Welcome everybody to what has been it's the second of our regional webinars around assessment. At the moment, there's been a lot of activity around assessment. There's been a course. There have been these two webinars, Samba last week and Ayotomi this week, giving different kind of angles on that. And then last week there were a series of webinars from the Central British Council. And so, it's a very important topic for all sorts of reasons. And what I think has been interesting, certainly I've learned a lot about assessment, different forms of assessment, particularly assessment for learning, is the different ways that we can look at assessment. So it's an important topic for all sorts of reasons, but maybe taking us away from the traditional sense of assessment that perhaps we all have. So, as I said, if people would like to put their names, well, we see your names, but if you'd like to put where you're from in the chat, and Ayotomi will be using the chat as we do in these sessions for a bit of interaction at various points. So please contribute. Obviously, there are a few people in the Telegram group as well. So I'm going to move on then to welcome Ayotomi Fasuyi, who is going to give us her take on improving learning through assessment. She'll introduce herself as well, and I'll sit in the background and deal with any questions. So over to you, Ayotomi.
Thank you very much, Gary. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It's such a pleasure to be with you this evening. My name is Ayotomi Fasuyi, and I will be talking about improving learning through assessment. That's the focus for this evening. So a brief about myself. Yeah, so I'm an English language teacher. I've been teaching English for well over 30 years now. Can I have the next slide, please, Gary? Welcome, everyone. You can see that quite a number of people are joining. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm especially grateful to the British Council for providing this platform for teachers in Africa so we can share ideas and we can get to do things better in our classrooms. As a teacher, an English teacher, interestingly, I guess I'm not someone who is very keen who thinks. I think I'm more pragmatic, and so my interest is really in the language skills of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, because I believe that that's the essence of every language. And so I would like to focus more on what students need to use the language to do. Well, a little bit about myself. Like I said, I've been teaching English since 1991, actually, because I have my qualifications in English, and I've taught at different levels, at the tertiary, at secondary, oversight functions at the primary levels. But currently, I work as the lead trainer for Vivor's First Education Services. We are an independent teacher training and education consultancy outfit. In addition to facilitating the Cambridge Teaching for schools around in Nigeria. So thank you very much. So this evening, we're going to be talking about how to improve learning through assessments. Can we go on to the slides? Yes. And for this, the next hour, I'm hoping that by the time we're done, every one of us should be able to relate assessment to learning. And that's going to be in very concrete terms. Well, we've been talking about assessment for quite a while, so we're just going to try to do a revision of the different types of assessment. The main focus of this webinar will be to explore some assessment for learning strategies in the classroom. And that's what we really want to spend some time on. So we're just going to go on now and look at some of the issues at hand. All right. So I'm going to be asking that we answer this question in the chat box. So when you hear the word assessment, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Can you please drop that in the chat box? I'll be glad to see your responses. What's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the word assessment? Yes, please put your answers in the chat box. The first word, thank you very much. So evaluation, yes, I see that. So when you hear assessment, your mind goes to evaluation. And somebody says, yes, it's about questions. Yes, let's have a few more. Still evaluation, okay, thank you. Assessment, asking, thank you. Yes, more. Motivation, fantastic. Yes, please. It's all about assessment, tests. Yes, evaluation, thank you, beautiful. So we all have an idea of what assessment is. Testing, yes, please. Okay, let's move on with it. And I hope that as we continue, we will have more. Oh, examination, yes. And that's what happens. Okay, so for every one of us as educators on this webinar today, I have that question for you. So when you teach in the classroom, how do you know that learning has taken place? So that's the question that educators are always going to continue to ask. How do I know if my learners have learned? How do I know when learning happens? And so there are several views to it, so I'm just going to be working with just the two that I have on the screen here. I know that learning has taken place when my learners do well on their tests and on their exams. Okay, so assessments, they've done well. And so you're happy with that. And that tells you that they have learned. Thank you. All right. Some other person says, I know learning has taken place in my classroom when my students can do the task by themselves without my input or support. Oh, yes. So that for you is learning. What's the link then between learning and assessment? So I'm just quickly going to go over that. The next slide, please, Gary. Assessment and learning. What's the link? Of course, just like I said, it is by assessment that we know that learning has taken place. But I want us to look at learning in some other terms. I know that oftentimes when educators are asked, what do you think learning is? What is your definition of learning? So there are several definitions of learning, but we want to see what's the link between learning and assessments. So when we define learning, we're going to be thinking of learning as that process of acquiring knowledge. Okay, next slide, please, Gary. So the Oxford Dictionary defines learning as the acquisition of knowledge or skills through study, through experience, or being taught. That's the general definition of learning, acquiring knowledge, acquiring skills. But I think that learning in the 21st century has taken a new dimension. And that's why we would have other definitions like what you have on the screen that says learning is a process that leads to change, which occurs as a result of experience and increases the potential for improved performance and future learning. I want to pitch my definition of learning with this. I think learning is more than acquiring knowledge. If learners are simply acquiring knowledge and passing their exams, and there is no change, there is no change between what they couldn't do before and what they could do now, can we say that learning has taken place? And so for us as educators, we need to constantly review our understanding of learning. And that's why I have it summarized on the next slide. Thank you, Gary. So we're saying here that the link between assessment and learning is how each teacher relates assessment to learning. What do I mean by that? So your notion about assessment is shaped by your definition of learning. If you think that assessment is about examinations, then learning for you might be that your learners are passing exams. But if you think that learning is about having a change in their behavior, your learners are able to solve maybe maths problems that they couldn't solve before, because I know that there are some other teachers that are not English teachers here. Perhaps your learners are able to write letters or essays that they couldn't write before. Maybe that for you is learning. And that is what we mean when we say that learning is seeing that change in behavior, getting learners to do what they couldn't do before. So we're going to be connecting learning in terms of what remains with your learners after they have left the classroom. When your learners, before you came into the classroom to help them with their letter writing, they really couldn't structure their letters, and then the teacher comes in and they're able to teach them, and afterwards they can write their letters, they can structure their letters. I think that is learning. So what then? What's the link? Learning, we will say, is when your learners gain a mental or physical grasp of the subject, just like I've said. You're teaching creative writing, and then your learners can actually write their stories creatively. That is having the physical grasp of the subject. They can make sense of what is being taught in the classroom. They're able to acquire new ability and knowledge in conjunction with skills that they already possess. I think that is learning. And I think that is how teachers should view learning. A whole lot of times, it is possible for learners to pass their examinations, and yet they aren't learning. I think some of us can relate with that. So let's move on and see, where does assessment come into learning? What is the link? How do we relate assessment to learning? Okay, so let's move to the next slide, please. We're looking at definitions of assessment. Okay, so let's try out this quick quiz. We want to identify the different types of assessments. So if you're going to be using the chat box again, I would want you to look at the types of assessments in the column to the left and the description for each time of the assessment. And I would like you to do a quick matching. So you're just matching the term to the description. So if you can put in the chat box an example, A to 1, B to 2, C to 3. Yes, something like that. Thank you. Yes, well done. I'm waiting to see your answers. I'm waiting to see your answers. We're matching the types of assessments to the description of the assessment. Please type in your answers in the chat. It's a quick quiz. Yes, let's get busy. Maybe this is my own way of assessing you. Some form of assessment. Yes, please. Waiting for your answers, please. Thank you. Keep them coming. All right, nice. Okay. Yes, diagnostic assessment. Well done. Yes, more. Keep the answers coming. Okay, great. Yes. Iyabu Akitola, thank you for your answers. Yes. You ain't done yet. Yes. Well done. 824. I'm not quite sure that's right. You want to check that again, Dr. Agbara? Thank you. Yes, let's look at it again. Come on, let's do this. Waiting for your answers. D to 6, E6. Are you sure? Okay. Well, let's keep the answers coming. F to 4. Nice. Well done. Yes, please. Yes. Great job, everyone. Okay. Thank you. All right. So, Gary, can we see the answers, please, on the next slide? Okay, so let's check our answers. So we're looking at the different kinds of assessments. And so we'll say that diagnostic assessments are those that are aimed at identifying areas where learners have strengths and challenges. So maybe this test that you just did, this quiz, is my diagnostic assessment to determine your understanding of assessments. Thank you. And then formative assessment, yes, that will be when teachers use information about learners' progress to give feedback and adapt their teaching. And honestly, I think this is the most important form of assessment when it comes to learning. If we're going to get your learners to learn, then we're going to be looking at formative assessment. Peer assessment happens when learners give feedback on each other's work. Summative assessment is done at the end of a course and learners receive a grade. Self-assessment happens when learners decide by themselves what progress they have made. And of course, portfolio assessment is when you have a collection of your learners' work over a period of time, and then they can actually look back and see where they were and where they're at. So these are various forms of assessment. Of course, there are still many more, but we're just going to limit it to just this. All right, so now let's move on. The most critical forms of assessment, as far as learning is concerned, will be our formative assessment, also known as AFL, Assessment for Learning. And as we have rightly seen in the definition, so that will be a situation where the teacher teaches in the class, you get feedback from your learners feedback becomes input into your teaching. And this is very critical for us, and that's why we're going to be looking critically at this. So summative assessment is what happens at the end of the learning engagement. It may be at the end of the course, it might be at the end of the term, it might be at the end of a session, whenever you need to check what your learners have learned, that will be your summative assessment. So for today, we're going to be looking more at formative assessment, AFL, Assessment for Learning. So what does it entail? What are the strategies? What can we do in class to ensure that learning actually happens? So we've already said that AFL occurs when the teacher uses information on learners' progress to adapt their teaching and to give your learners feedback of their learning. Yeah, so that is restating what AFL is. So how do we go about this? What do we do in the classroom to ensure that learning is happening? Thank you, Steve. The next slide, please. All right. So I'm going to be looking at these three aspects of AFL: self-assessment, peer assessment, and teacher feedback. So a whole lot of times, teachers are of the opinion that their learners cannot assess themselves. And I think this is not very right. As far as I'm concerned, self-assessment is the basis for learning. when you know where you're at, what you can do and what you can't do, that is self-assessment. I'm going to be looking at these few elements of self-assessment: sharing learning objectives, sharing success criteria, providing learners with samples of successful tasks, encouraging learners to use learning trackers, use of graphic or visual organizers, and then developing reflection strategies. So let's take them quickly, one after the other. Self-assessment. How do you let your learners assess themselves? So the first one, we're sharing their learning objectives. When you share the learning objectives, so for many of us in our teaching situations in our schools, it has become part of our teaching procedures to share our lesson objectives with our learners. But it's more than just sharing it to them just so that they know what they'll be doing in the class. This is a very vital tool for self-assessment. Can we move on to the next slide, Gary? Let's look at what we can do with sharing the learner's objectives. So at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher provides the learners with the objectives for the lesson. How do we go about this? We can use the WALT, W-A-L-T, which simply stands for we are learning to. I've also seen some teachers use it as what are we learning today? I guess it means the same thing. We are learning to. What are we learning today? So oftentimes, teachers share the learning objectives with the learners. But I'm going to be saying that if you want to use your lesson objectives as a great way to develop self-assessment, then you need to get your learners to look at the objectives and personalize. They need to personalize the lesson objectives. So oftentimes, teachers just state the objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the verbs in the sentences. You should be able to use different kinds of verbs. I think we need to do more by personalizing the objectives. You drill your learners to think of it as something that they do personally, privately. How do they do this? By the end of this lesson, I should be able. That is what your learners should take in. That is what they should take down. And that is how it builds into self-assessment. So that at the end of the lesson, perhaps during your plenary session, the teacher is able to ask the learners, okay, so now let's look at our lesson objectives. Are you able, at the end of this lesson, to do those things that I said we're going to do at the beginning of the lesson? And then you give your learners time to consider whether they're actually able to do that. So that's self-assessment at work as an element of formative assessment. Let's move on to the next one. Apart from sharing learning objectives, what else could we do with our learners? Building self-assessment will be that the teacher shares the success criteria for given tasks. So in every lesson, you are given tasks for the lesson, what the learners get to do. Maybe you're using the presentation, practice, production approach. You've given them the learning objectives. You've presented the content for the lesson so that they can get practice in class. Your learners should be able to ask themselves, how do I know when I have done a good job? How do I know if I've answered this question correctly? And so, teachers provide the learners with a success criteria, and that is what you call your WILF, W-I-L-F, what I am looking for. I've given you an example of success criteria for paragraph writing on this page. So this teacher is helping the learners to develop good paragraphs, but getting them to assess themselves before it comes to you as the teacher. Help your learners check what they are doing. They can assess themselves, and that helps their learning. So the learners can use this success criteria. They can tick, I'm writing my paragraph. Do I have a topic sentence? Yes or no? The learner can check. You've taught them what topic sentences are. They can look at their paragraph. They can decide whether they have a topic sentence or not. They can look out for it. And that's a way of assessing themselves. So the learner can tick in the success criteria. I have a topic sentence, yes, so I can move on. I have supporting sentences, great. I've given supporting details. I think I'm doing well as far as my paragraph writing is concerned. My ideas are organized, yes. Your learners can do this. In fact, I usually recommend that every learner should be able to get the success criteria at their levels. If you're teaching at the primary level, use success criteria that your learners can understand. If you're teaching your learners punctuation, the success criteria is, have I used capital letters at the beginning of this sentence? Have I used full stop at the end of this sentence? So that way they can check, and then they can see whether they are doing well or not before it even comes to you as the teacher. Okay, so let's do a quick task here. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to be asking us to try our hands at this. Okay, so I'm giving you a choice. I would like you to write out your success criteria for any of these 3 topics. Not more than 4 statements. We're using the chat box, please. So if you're teaching your learners how to use punctuation, what will be your success criteria for your learners? Please put it down in 3 bullets, 4 statements. Okay, sorry, 4 statements, 4 bullets. Somebody else might want to try. If you're teaching your learners how to use transitions, what will be your success criteria? Please put it in the chat box. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses. If you're teaching your learners how to organize a story, what will be your success criteria? Please put it on. Thank you. I'm waiting to see your answers. What will be your success criteria? You may want to put it 1 statement at a time. Maybe you don't want to put all of them at the same time, yes, so that we can see different versions. You can put it in 1 sentence at a time. Success criteria for using punctuations. Success criteria for using transitions. Do I know the different punctuation? Thank you for that. Yes, your ability to use full stop. Can we put it in a way that the learners will understand? Let's try that. Let's try that. Yes, let's see. Mr. Oswald, so your success criteria will need to be reframed because you're using it for your learners. Have I put a full stop at the end of the sentence? That may be the way you want to frame it. Thank you, Jocelyn. Have I provided the description of the setting? Okay. Am I able to use the correct punctuation in my sentences? Thank you. Organizing the story, fantastic. Can I introduce a story? Can I build a fantastic? So we need to do more of this for our learners, so that before the work even gets to you, before they submit the tasks to you, they can look at the work themselves, they can decide whether they have done the right thing. This is what we mean assessment for learning, self-assessment. So your learner gets to check. Oh, thank you. Yeah, did I use capital letters? Are there full stops at the end? Do the proper nouns are fantastic? Yes. So let's do more of this and share the success criteria with our learners. Thank you very much. Okay, I like the way Vivian has put it. So using statements instead of questions. Yes, that's another way around it. I can rearrange the sentence correctly. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on now. For your story, yes, do I have an introduction, a climax, and the conclusion? Thank you very much. So let's do more of this. Let's move on, Gary. So we want to look at still other forms of self-assessment. So one fantastic way of getting our learners to assess themselves is to provide them with authentic material. So you're showing them samples, you're showing them examples. If you want to teach creative writing, you can get your learners to be interested, to want to see what's the best way of writing a story. And what do you do? Get into the classroom with storybooks. So they get to see how the stories are. You can use short stories. You can use entire storybooks. These are fantastic ways of getting our learners to do great jobs. You're teaching your learners writing. Nothing stops you from using actual letters. Look through your own folders, your personal folders. Take out the real letters that you have. Take it into your classroom. Show your learners what a letter looks like. Many of our kids these days don't even know what letters look like. And yet, it is still a topic in the curriculum. We're still going to be teaching them letter writing. So how do you want them to imagine if they've never seen one? So provide your learners, and then with the samples. When they see samples, then you can use that as a model for their forms of writing. Okay, so that's one way of getting your learners to self-assess. Let's move on, please. So let's look at another way to go about self-assessment. You can get your learners to assess themselves by using learning trackers. All right, so I have an example of a learning tracker here that I use with senior secondary school students. That's the image you're seeing on the screen. So what do we do with it? So they have their syllabus and their curriculum, and we have all of them at each topic and grade themselves. Where am I at? How well am I doing? Kind of essays in this tracker, informative writing. So you as the teacher, you can help your learners to track their progress. After teaching the topic, you get them to do a test, an essay, they write something, and then you share the assessment criteria with them, the success criteria, and then your learners can actually determine whether they have done well or not. They can rate themselves. I think a whole lot of times teachers the ones, and that could be very limiting, you know, assess themselves. In addition to user learning trackers, let's see, what else do we have for self-assessment? Can we move on? Gary? Self-assessment, help our learners learn by getting them to. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, graphics of getting your learner. Just 3 examples of graphic organizers. And I'm going to be asking us, I know that many of us are English teachers. What would you be using to teach your
Tony, I don't know whether it's the same for others, but your sound is breaking up quite badly. So I'm gonna turn your video off.
I use graphic organizers in my class. Content, having delivered others, to use a to summarize their topic. Hi, Gary.
Yeah, I'm turning your video. Yeah, I'm turning your video off because your sound is breaking up.
Network. All right, Gary, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, please carry on. Please carry on.
Okay. Am I good to go?
Yeah, you're good to go now. Try again, yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, so using graphic and visual organizers. So I'm saying here that it's a great way of getting our learners to assess themselves. So I'm going to be asking us, look at these graphic organizers on the screen. I have here a cycle. I have a Venn diagram. I have a process chart or a flow chart. So I'm going to be asking you in the chat now, what would you be teaching? What concept in English would you be teaching? And you will ask your learners to use any of these graphic organizers to summarize the concept. Can we please put our answers in the chat? So I would like you to think about what you would be teaching that you will ask your learners to summarize using a cycle, an information text. Which organizer will you be asking them to use? A Venn. Which organizer will you be asking them to use? A cycle, to summarize a circular story. Okay, well, I hope that works well for you. Life cycle of a frog, an explanation text. Okay, so what will you be teaching? And you ask your learners to use a Venn. You could have a 2-second Venn, you could have a 3-second Venn. Yeah. Sequence and flow chart. Yes. Sequencing. For what kind of topic? Flow chart. Fantastic. Giving directions. Thank you for that. Yes, please. Chronological statements using the flow chart. Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, I'm still waiting. Who is going to be using the Venn? What would you be teaching? And you would use a Venn. Instructions, yes, using the flow chart. Fantastic. So Venns are great whenever you have to teach topics that have to do with similarities and differences. Perhaps you're teaching different types of letter writing, for instance. Maybe you're teaching informal letters, formal letters, and semi-formal letters. It would be great to use a vein. Ask your learners to use a vein to show you the similarities and the differences between the different kinds of letters. This is assessment for learning. And these are ways of getting your learners to think about their learning, to take ownership of their learning more or less before it even comes to you as the teacher to review. Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on now. Yes, Gary, next slide, please. So, still talking about self-assessment, we're looking at how to develop reflection strategies. At the end of your lesson, do you get your learners to reflect? And this is where your wills comes in. What I learned today. So we need to create time during our plenary sessions to help our learners reflect on their learning. You could ask reflection questions, such as you have on the screen. What did you find easy in today's lesson? What did you find difficult? Were you surprised at anything? What else do you think you need to do? And get the learners to reflect on their learning. We really need them to learn, not just to pass their tests, not just to pass their exams. I think it goes the other way around. When your learners learn, then your summative assessment becomes pretty easy. All right, so that's self-assessment. Let's see if we can still quickly look at peer assessment. Peer assessment. Let's move on, Gary. Peer assessment. Okay, so I have here just 4 assessments, marking according to assessment criteria. I know that a number of teachers are very skeptical about peer assessment, but I think you're depriving your learners of great learning when you deprive them of peer assessment. 2 stars, 1 wish. That's another way of doing peer marking. Students writing questions for each other, groups assessing one another. Let's quickly go through this. All right, so I'll start with the first one, peer marking according to assessment criteria. What does this entail? The same way you provide success criteria for their tasks, you could also provide assessment criteria, and that helps to guide your learners in terms of what they are doing. So what you do is when they're done with their task, you simply tell them to swap. So they swap their worksheets, they swap their notebooks, and then you provide them with the assessment criteria, let them know why this is important for their learning, and then the learners mark each other's work based on the assessment criteria you have given. This is great, especially for objective questions. Whatever kind of objective questions you're using, it may be your multiple choice questions, your true false questions, your yes no questions. Of course, we know that these are all objective questions because they have only one correct answer. So it's easy. Provide them with the assessment criteria and get them to mark each other's work. The second one for peer assessment is to get your learners to mark each other's work and give feedback. And this is especially useful for subjective questions. Subjective questions are those where the marker's opinion and judgment is used. Now, let me share with you one way I have used peer marking in my essay writing classes. So when my learners have their essays to turn in, maybe their first draft or their second draft, so I just tell them, open to that page and leave it on your desk. Move around the classroom, read at least 3 other persons' essays. This is great for your learners. They get to see what their peers are doing. I've seen that it is motivational for their learning. I've seen that it is inspirational. I've seen that it makes your learners take ownership of their learning. Okay, so that's one way of getting them to do peer evaluation. Now, peer marking, you could actually get them to swap their notebooks, and then you ask them to give 2 stars and 1 wish. What are the 2 stars? So they are reading each other's work. Don't forget that these are subjective, maybe essays, maybe letters, compositions. And then they learn to give each other feedback. This may not work perfectly the first time you try it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try it again. So tell them to tell each other, what do you like about this writing? What do you like about the way she structured her letter? What do you like? So 2 things that they like about the task and 1 wish. 1 wish, what the writer think, 1 thing that the writer can improve on. So they're giving each other feedback. And I think if we take time to do this, we might have more engaging lessons, more interesting classes, and then your learners actually learn. Let's move on to the next strategy. Now, this is one that I personally love to use. Students write questions for each other. How does it work? So, when I want to review what they have learned, usually the plenary at the end of the session, I just ask my learners, generate 5 questions, generate 3 questions from the topic we've learned today. You will be amazed at the quality of questions that your learners can come up with. I have seen that happen severally in my classes. So they generate the questions, and then I ask them to swap their questions on the topic that we just learned. When they swap their questions, each student now provides answers to the questions that have been asked by their classmates. It's usually a very interesting session, and I would really implore you to try it. When they're done with that, they return the answered questions, and of course with the original questions, to the owner of the questions, their peer that set up the question, and then they give each other feedback. Usually a fantastic way of checking learning, and I urge you to try it out in your class. Finally, for peer assessment, we're going to be looking at learners giving each other feedback in groups. So we know that group activities are great for cooperative and collaborative learning. To enrich it the more, when you're setting up your group task, you could actually tell your learners that they're going to be assessing one another's group task. So what happens? They predetermine the assessment criteria for the task before they engage in it. And then when they're done with their group task and they're giving feedback, maybe they're giving group presentations, and when they make their presentation in the class, other groups give feedback to the group that is making the presentation. Of course, I would always say, if you've never tried this before, don't expect that it's going to be perfect the first time you try. And then we need to break it into little steps anyway, so that we're not overloading the learners. Okay, let's move on now. So the last bit of assessment for learning that we want to look at has to do with teacher feedback. So I'm always going to be asking teachers, if you're still giving your learners a 0 grade, I want you to go back in time to yourself as a learner. And I'm going to be asking you to put your feedback in the chat box. If you ever, in the course of your schooling, primary, secondary, learning scored a zero score on any task, what did you do with your zero script? In all sincerity, please put it in the chat box. Put it in the chat box. What did you do with your zero script? When your teacher gave you back the script, oh dear, Hilda cried bitterly. Oh dear. All right. Yeah. And I hope that helped you to learn. Well, yes. Who else? What did you do? Oh, Oluchi said she tore it off. Felix, you trashed it. You were so disappointed. Oh dear. You were sad, you hid it from others, you tore it and threw it away. Oh dear. So now you see, nothing has changed. The learners are still the same way you are. So when we give them zero on their tasks, it becomes very demoralizing. It becomes very discouraging, just like you have mentioned. And then I really wonder, so why did the teacher spend time grading the scripts? Why did you spend time grading the scripts if your learners are not going to be doing anything with the script when they get it? So one good way of using our learners' work, their tasks, to help them to learn is to ensure that the learners get back to the task. How do you ensure that that happens? That's what I have here. Use correction codes. These are examples of correction codes. Your codes may be different from mine. You know your class, you know your learners, you know the codes that work well with them. The only thing that you need to do to use your correction codes is to ensure that your learners understand the meaning of the codes. So I'm going to be advising that if you want to use correction codes to help your learners reflect on their errors, make a chart of your correction codes. Put it up somewhere in your classroom where your learners can easily access it. So what happens is when you grade their work, you use the correction codes. Instead of providing the correct answers all the time. So what you're going to be doing is you signpost, you just put a little mark, whether with your pencil or with your red pen, whatever you're marking with, and then you put the code. If a learner has made a spelling error, instead of providing the correct spelling, you're simply going to be writing the code SP on that word. What do you hope to achieve? So the learner is going to look at that script and then wonder, why SP? It means that this is a wrong spelling. You want the learner to get back to that task and see if they can provide the right spelling. That is what we do with the correction codes. Let's move on. We're quickly running out of time. So in addition to using correction codes, there are times when you can use comment-only marking. Comment only. How does this work? No grades, no scores. So you're reading your learner's work and you're using comments. I recommend using the CRC technique. And what CRC stands for, like you can see on the screen, is commend, recommend, and comment. I've given you an example here. So my learner has submitted an essay, and perhaps this essay may not be a very excellent job, but there's always something to commend the learner for. So I've commended this learner's handwriting, and I've said lovely handwriting. What's my recommendation? You need to be more careful with your tenses and punctuation. Apparently, I would have used my correction codes to indicate the wrong tenses, and the wrong punctuations. And then my final comment, I'm going to be saying, I look forward to reading your corrected work. Okay, can I get you to use the CRC technique to make comments in the chat room, for a learner's task that if you had put a score to it, perhaps the learner would have scored maybe 2 marks out of 10. But of course, you're not putting the mark. You're not putting any comments will be like for a task that ordinarily would have been 9 marks out of 10. Waiting to see your comments in the chat. Waiting to see your comments in the chat. 2 out of 10. What would you comment? What would you recommend? What would be your comments? Let's try it. These are great ways of assessing for learning. So that when you give feedback to your learners, then they can always go back to what they have done initially. Fantastic. Thank you, Oluchi. Good effort. I would love that to read the rubrics next time. Please read the rubrics and submit a better job. Thank you very much. Whoops, a weak performance. Dyke, I'm not sure. I really like that. We need to encourage our learners, don't you think? What would you be commending? There needs to be something you're commending. And then you want to be very explicit with what you're recommending. Telling me it's a weak performance, you haven't shown me what I didn't do right. Thank you. So maybe you want to try that again. Nice concept, okay, if that works. You need to develop your paragraphs more, okay? Thank you. Good effort, you can do more. What is good about the effort? Can you please be more specific? That is how to get our learners to learn. Let's be more specific. When you just say good, fair, excellent, you're really not telling that learner anything. They want to know what is good about their work. They want to know what is not so good. So can we please be more specific when we're giving our comments? I recall that when I learned about this and I applied it in my class, I was pleasantly surprised when 2 of my learners walked up to me and said, "Excuse me, madam, do you actually read our essays?" And I said, "Oh my, what do you think I do?" And then they said, "Well, we just thought you just used to give us marks arbitrarily." So this is what happens when you give feedback. Good ideas, grammar mistakes, can do better. Okay, thank you. Good narrative, improve on your spelling. Okay, please ensure that you have the 3 parts to your feedback. Commending first, recommending next, and then a final comment. Okay? I'm also going to be advising that when you do this, please ensure that you make out time in the class. Of course, it is no longer news that many of our learners are really not taking time to go work. So we're doing a whole lot of the work in the classroom. So please make out time to get your learners to do the corrections during class time. If you can't do it during class time, please make sure you get back to their correct work. This helps so that your learners can take ownership of their learning. They can become responsible for their learning. And honestly, if they're able to do this, we will see that summative assessment will be a walkover for our learners. Thank you so much for your feedback comments. Yes, Let's do more of this. Yes, it's going to take some more time. Yes, some more time to read through. But I tell you, it's going to yield greater learning results. Okay? All right. So let's move on and see how we can quickly finish this up. Use up time already. Okay, Gary, can I just move on to the next slide and tell you up on all of this? All right. Thank you. Oh, lovely comments. Thank you. Hold on for a complete note. Please improve on your handwriting. Yes, final comment. Well, beautiful as heck. Welcome, present says, I would love to read more of your writing. Nice. Okay, so now let's get to do some reflections. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying the session. So before we leave off, so share with me. Cheryl, have you learned from this webinar? I'll be glad to have your feedback. Activities. Are you likely to try out in your class? Your reflection responses on the chat box, please. Reflection responses on the chat box. Oh, thank you. I hope you use that in your class. Thank you, Madam CRC. Peer assessment, fantastic. Peer assessments are great. Please, let's use more of it. Okay, nice. Yes, waiting for your responses. Reflections, please. Thank you. All right, so while we're done with that, Gary, can I still take a few questions? We've run out of time. Thank you very much. Learning trackers, very helpful.
Yeah, I think we've run out of time, Ayotomi.
Yes, please.
I think there's a bit of a delay on your sound. So can you hear me okay?
I can hear you loud and clear.
So as I've said in the chat, so if people have questions, we're going to have a follow-up session next Friday on the Telegram group. So Friday at 5 o'clock, 5 p.m. GMT. Yeah. So both Ayotomi and Masamba, who also did his session on assessment for learning, will be available next Friday to answer any questions you have. So maybe people could go away and have a try over the next week with some of the great ideas you presented. Some really lovely ideas there. So perhaps you could try to build some of those into your teaching, and then you could report back how you've been doing. So that would be a great kind of
okay, Gary.